Hello everyone, my name is William Tafstan and welcome to my brand new YouTube channel. As the people voted on, this video is a in-depth analysis about the 2022 midterms overall. I won't be covering the specifics of any one race as this video has already been rewritten once or twice and it is still far too long for my taste. And I think other people would be more suited, I focus rather on the overall trends of the nations in each state rather than like the specifics of what happened, but I'll lightly touch them. The 2022 midterms were ultimately a massive flop for the GOP, despite all indicators pointing towards a massive red wave, such as Biden's approval being like 42 the day of the election, massive year-over-year inflation, high gas prices, multiple Biden administrative failures. The Republicans managed to lose a Senate seat. We achieved a small majority in the House. One race is yet to be called, and that's Bobart's Colorado 3. Several seats we should have flipped with no trouble. Simply did not flip. We have examples such as Nevada Senate and several governorships that we should have flipped easily. But at the same time, there were some really tough seats that were also victories, which were fantastic, which leads to the question of how is this the shift map? How is this the end result? From bitter primaries to shocking overperformances to establishment victories, we will be discussing all of this and more. And our first topic is going to be the 2022 redistricting, real quick. So, real quick, the first battle lines of the 2022 midterms were shown right after the 2022 census when the redistricting process was occurring. GOP is going to end up with a 222 to 213 majority. Both sides gerrymandered, and basically only three states, Ohio, North Carolina, and New York, really got hit by their courts to completely redistrict. But the total ended up being +6 Democratic leaning seats and -6 highly competitive seats. But what this doesn't show you here is that the GOP really focused. I think we gained like 10 or 12 like safe R seats, which is what the GOP's general strategy was to up the amount of safe R seats we had and get rid of a bunch of competitive districts. And overall, some people like to say, oh, GOP gerrymandered their way into the House. No, we didn't. Overall, as of this moment, redistricting was favorable to Dems. Expected mid-decade redistricting from Texas, Ohio, and North Carolina. With these three doing a mid-decade redistricting, one can assume we can probably cut down this +6 to maybe +4, +3, hopefully +0. That would be beneficial. And in the event that the VRA Section 2 gets nuked, there are quite a few southern seats that can also be nuked along with that. And GOP should have nuked the Lexington seat, much like they did with I think it was the Nashville seat here, yeah. So, the GOP could have been more aggressive. When you have a place like Illinois making this monstrosity, you know, both sides are terrible. Dems are even worse. GOP could have done better. But after redistricting was done, the battle lines were set for the 2022 primaries, which is where things start to get real interesting. So let's go on to the primaries. All right. So I think we all on Con Election Twitter, we all really enjoyed the primaries. It was both fun and stressful. But let's see the real world effects that they had. Let's look at this map. There were about 18 states with competitive primaries that were statewide. I'm counting Alaska's ranked choice voting as a competitive primary. and I'm counting Wyoming at large because it was a statewide election, so it counts for this purpose. But the point is that the GOP had rough primaries everywhere, with the shade indicating how bad it was, you know. And if you look at the Democrat map, you know, I'm not exactly an expert on the Democrats' primary season. I was way more focused on our own, but generally, the Democratic Party picked its candidate, and that candidate happened, you know? I mean, look at the difference between these. And each of these primaries, no matter what, was resources burnt and wasted that could have gone towards the general. Now, you might be asking, is there a number you can put to this? And I sort of can. So picking the seats that we had to defend or the seats that we thought were flippable, I put them into a chart here. And what do we have? Well, we have the primary win percentage. So what was the percentage you got in the primary? And I got the primary win difference, which I think is slightly more important because if you look at J.D. Vance of Ohio Senate and Dr. Oz of the Pennsylvania Senate, they both won the primary by about the exact same percentages, but their primary win difference was significant. And you can kind of see that translate in the compared to 2020, compared to Trump 2020. So on average, if you got less than 50% in your primary, you did 1.2 points worse than Trump did in 2020 of these battleground states, which are the ones that really matter. If we subtract just DeWine's massive overperformance for getting less than 50% in a primary, then you did 2.1 points worse than Trump 2020. And if you subtract both DeWine and Doug's massive underperformance, then you still did 0.8 points worse than Trump. And we can see that here in these trend lines, you know, just generally. The worse you did in the primary or the closer your primary was, the worse you did overall. You know, and especially if we remove the massive under and massive overperformers, you know, this is what it looks like. You know, we see that it is just really a real detriment to the GOP to have all of these brutal primaries that just slowed us down. And I even have one here for the incumbents, subtracting the Idaho incumbents because they had third parties, which oddly enough, if an incumbent did worse in the primary, he did better in the general. So this was just a fun fact I happened to come across. So do what you want with that info. But the more important thing is that overall, we can see that competitive primaries did hurt us in the battleground seats. And of course, politics is a lot more complex than just did you win your primary, you know, fully. We have Minnesota governor, you know, he won the primary by 82.7%. He won it with 90% of the vote basically. He still underperformed Trump. But this does show that the GOP had a resource allocation problem with how many resources we dumped into these primaries. For example, I know Peter Thiel gave $15 million to JD Vance in the primary alone. That is $50 million not spent attacking Democrats. That's just the way it is. But speaking of resource allocation and the GOP's failure to do so,
Get on a raft with Taft.
so the GOP simply failed to allocate its resources properly. A lot of people go, oh, you know, the Democrats out fundraised the GOP, you know, we lost because of that. And that's technically not true. The GOP just failed to allocate its resources because the establishment wanted to defend itself. One of the most egregious examples, for example, is that Lisa Murkowski received at least $9 million from Mitch McConnell's PAC and whatnot. She is literally the de facto Dem nominee there. $9 million, you know. Adam Laxalt lost his race by about 8,000 votes. And $9 million, I definitely think could have closed the gap there, And Mitch McConnell just would rather have an establishment candidate than have a non-establishment candidate in the Senate, which is terrible. If we look at the money here, Republican candidate, note real quick, this was late October because we haven't had the candidates haven't had to fill out their financial forms yet, and it's not public information yet. I think it turns public, I don't know, January. But as of October, state candidates were outraising Democrat candidates, right? But the problem is that the GOP's new white working class base in a lot of ways prefers to give to candidates who, for lack of a better word, are a cult of personality. DeSantis, Trump. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Reagan, Kennedy were both cult of personality leaders, and it worked out pretty well for them. But for example, here we have like a $200 million lead. Yeah, we can subtract 200 million from the Republican Party because it went to DeSantis, who was in a safe state, and then I don't know how much Trump raised, but it was more than 200 million. So you can see that more money was entering them. I don't know if this counts Trump, by the way. More money was entering Republican side, but it was not being spent correctly. Senate Leadership Fund and the Congressional Leadership Funds, both Republican, both had more spending than the Democrats, right? But if you look here, who spent what where? I know in Pennsylvania we were outspent. You know, Georgia we were probably outspent. Arizona we were outspent. We outspent in Ohio. We also probably outspent in Wisconsin. I'm unsure about Nevada Senate. We outspent in North Carolina. We outspent in Florida. We were probably outspent here. We dumped how much? Okay, well both sides dumped $60 million into Missouri Senate. A 13-point win for Eric Schmidt. Completely unnecessary that he got, you know, nearly $60 million was spent there. I doubt the Dems spent 30 million. I'm pretty sure this was the GOP pouring money back into Schmidt. Ohio got $200 million from both sides, and I think the GOP in the end outspent Ryan. This is ridiculous. 200 million and then another, 120 million. Rubio did not need 120 million. I mean, I know some of this is Democrat, but even if it's 50% of it, these numbers are ridiculous from the GOP. Guys, these aren't swing states anymore. This was unnecessary completely. Hell, I'm not even sure if North Carolina Senate was that necessary for us to be spending that much money. It's a crying shame that Nevada is this low, you know. And this is just, Senate races. When you talk about the RGA in the end ended up leaving a lot of candidates to the wolves, and maybe that's the right call in the end. But at the time, he didn't know that. Doug Ducey's RGA sent over $20 million to Ron DeSantis. And I can tell you, if Rubio's winning by 17, Ron won by 19.4. He did not need that at all, frankly. And this isn't counting in the House races. If we look here in the House races, I can assure you, we left Jeremy Małżewiecki out for drying. Someone like Joe Kent, right? For example, Joe Kent's probably the best example. McCarthy spent millions of dollars against him, right? And this kind of goes back to the bitter primaries thing. Spends millions of dollars against the guy. Of course he's going to underperform because then you give him no money in the general, And Joe Kent's no fundraising machine, So very, very disappointing. And McCarthy all across the country spent millions of dollars in primaries, not to keep the GOP conservative, but to ensure McCarthy was safe. which is ridiculous. And then you have, here in the Senate, we chucked away one, two, three, four, probably four seats. I don't know. This one might have been too far gone. We chucked away several seats, more or less so McConnell could keep his seat as minority leader. You know, one thing is that even if we had gained 54, we had a incredibly slim chance of taking out McConnell. I think it probably would have been 28 in favor of McConnell, 28 to 26. McConnell, the votes really weren't there without a lot of bribing, but he still would rather be completely assured he's reelected and throw away our chances at the Senate. And you know what? As for the House, I'm not sure why McCarthy tanked several candidates who would have threatened him. I mean, obviously, if the House majority was going to be this slim, then yes, that was the right move. But a lot of people were expecting like a 230 floor kind of deal, and he frankly would have been hailed as a hero if we had gotten 230. I think he would have been fine. I know that McCarthy is bribing votes and threatening people already. We'll have to see how that works. But Emmer and McCarthy threw away millions of dollars just to keep the establishment in control. And that is a complete failure by our leadership, which is our next talking point.
Get on a raft with Taft.
Gas prices, inflation, gas prices, inflation, gas prices, inflation. Oops, we just sent $40 billion to Ukraine. What was the GOP's messaging this year? Well, that's kind of a two-part problem. One is what our messaging was, and two, what was the messaging that was being said to the voters through ads. An example of this was throughout the general election, all the polls showed Lake having a good lead on Masters, when you compared the two. And a lot of people were saying, who the hell was a Mark Kelly Lake supporter? And quite simply, the biggest demographic of that was an old Republican who was concerned about Social Security. And according to my dad, who lives there while he was in the hospital at the time, 24/7 the ad, Mark Kelly hammering the hell out of Masters on his quote about privatizing Social Security was just constantly being played, apparently. Pretty sure the same happened in New Hampshire. And in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Doug and Dixon both made comments that were extreme pro-life policies that the general public just isn't ready for now. I'm not going to talk too much about Dobbs. Dobbs probably cost us Michigan, Pennsylvania. But overall, I don't think Dobbs had too much of an effect. The only group that became overtly hostile to the GOP because of Dobbs was unmarried women who are already a ridiculously hostile group. But, the thing is that even though we probably had a fundraising advantage, we just didn't spend it correctly, and that allowed the airwaves, especially during early voting, to be dominated by the Democrats, and they were the ones in control of the conversation in all the swing states, which is why they did so well where they did. If we look here, basically everywhere in Arizona shifted to the left, everywhere in Pennsylvania shifted to the left. It's ridiculous, frankly. And our actual messaging was just straight up bad. We talked about inflation and gas prices, and we didn't really come up with a solution for them. For gas prices, we talked about energy independence, but the problem with gas prices, right? Yeah, it peaked around June, July. And if you notice, June, July is definitely when Biden's approval rating was the absolute worst. Gas prices were really tied to Joe Biden and not the Democratic Party as a whole. And come the election day, it wasn't great. It wasn't terrible though. Gas prices, plus after a year of living with these type of gas prices, most people were okay with them. The leadership of McDaniel, McCarthy, and McConnell all failed in creating a good campaign message against the Dems despite all their weaknesses. because they were all focused on ensuring that the establishment survived this year. McConnell is saying the most important thing in the world was Ukraine, hurt a lot of the base, demoralized us. The only states where we had, good messaging were here in New York and here in California. A lot of this is due to top of the ticket governors uh, cracking down on crime, talking about it 24/7, really hitting the airwaves because the Dems spent basically all of their money in Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and probably Ohio a little bit, and Georgia. And another thing is that, a lot of people say, oh, Whitmer should have been so easy to beat. We should have hammered her on lockdowns. I'm going to be honest, after seeing the re-election numbers of all the pro-lockdown governors, I don't think it would have mattered. I think the only individuals who care about lockdowns are the GOP primary voters, as shown in the Ohio primary compared to the Ohio general. But either way, overall, the GOP failed to create a captive message that would have won over Indies and bring out the base. And we know this because in Pennsylvania exit polls, people who were concerned about the economy voted Democrat over Republican. And I remember when we saw the polls saying, the top issue on the ballot is the economy. Most people just also auto assume that, well, because inflation and gas prices have been so high, people are automatically, that group is siding with the GOP when they simply were not, you know. And now we're going to talk about what occurred in the Rust Belt mostly and Turnout.
Get on a raft with Taft.
The Rust Belt specifically, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, sort of, Michigan, even Ohio, saw a complete collapse in white working class rural turnout. Biggest example is Pennsylvania, to be honest. Pennsylvania's rurals were 11% of the total voter group this year. Compare that to the 22% they were of the 2020 election. A massive decrease. We can also see in the Minnesota rurals, I'm going to put up a couple of posts right here from the Minnesota Populist on Twitter. And we can see that during 2020, generally what happened was there'd be a large group of Trump voters and a smaller group of Biden voters. But when it came to the governor election this year, basically every Biden voter showed up and like a third of the Trump voters just simply disappeared into the wind. In Arizona, Lake underperformed in several of the rural counties due to the lower turnout of rural people. Rurals were 2% lower. In North Carolina, rurals dropped 3%. In Ohio, it dropped, I think, 6%. The only exception is actually Wisconsin, where rural turnout was up compared to 2022. And I think that's the only reason that, Ron Johnson squeaked by against an actual black supremacist. Wild, by the way. I almost give up on Wisconsin here. And this is just an overall problem that the GOP is going to have is the turnout here in the Rust Belt, rural Rust Belt, is super reliant on either presidential years or on Trump. We better hope it's presidential years because if they are reliant only on Trump, then the party is in a really bad spot. We have a really bad coalition, no matter what. We made massive gains in New York. I know this isn't the governor race, but I can't find this version of the map for the governor race, but we made massive gains in a bunch of like safe red areas. Everywhere safe red swung massively towards us. Indiana, Iowa, at least for the Kansas Senate race. South Dakota, Washington, California, all those swung massively to the right. A lot of the two big blue states, California and New York, also swung massively to the right. Joe OD did so unbelievably terrible, it's funny. And that's another problem is with our turnout. The base was amped up in safe blue areas and was amped up in safe red areas, The base in the competitive areas was not amped up, which is why the Dems were able to stem the bleeding so efficiently. Speaking of California, New York, let's talk about the top of the ticket real quick.
Get on a raft with Taft.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin, for giving us, I think, 5 seats in New York single-handedly, causing a massive red wave here. Really appreciate that. Guy is MVP. He should be in charge of the RNC, frankly. And also thank you over in California. California GOP also did phenomenal with a lot of the seats here. I will get back to them shortly. But I want to talk about New York and Pennsylvania. They're both right next to each other. And I want to talk about top of the ticket. So, top of the ticket has shown it to be one of the most important things here. Zeldin's massive overperformance compared to 2020 allowed ours to pick up New York 17, New York 19, I think New York 22, New York 3, New York 4 definitely. And yeah, these seats were won solely based off of Zeldin's overperformance. And this is something that the GOP really needs to learn is that top of the ticket makes a massive difference nowadays. If we look here in Pennsylvania, we probably should have won District 8. We probably should have won District 7. We probably should have won 17. Hell, probably not 6, but there's like 3 seats here in Pennsylvania that we should have won, but Doug Mastroni pulled down the entire ticket so poorly that we lost 3 seats here. The same can kind of be said here in Michigan. Had our top of the ticket done better, there's a couple more seats we could have won. In Ohio, it's just these two. I mean, this was a disappointment, but Captor did a massive overperformance. But either way, top of the ticket is so important nowadays. Or if you don't want top of the ticket, you better be ballot harvesting like the California uh, Republicans. They saw how good and how effective it was, and they said, okay, well, we're gonna start doing it. That's how we have like John Dewart still going, or going now, I guess. We have Young Kim doing more than fine. Where is Garcia? There's Mike Garcia, Mr. DOA. Redistricted into a bluer district does better. Love the guy. Fantastic. And one can argue, for example, not house wise, uh, AZ's got kind of screwed here, which is good. But Mark Kelly probably carried over all the statewide Dems who did win, and the GOP has to be way more careful about who it nominates at the top of the ticket. For example, Bobart almost lost with the complete collapse in Colorado rurals thanks to Joe O'D being probably the worst candidate ever, who is too right wing to win the suburbans, and at the same time is just pissing on the base 24/7. So wild, good job, Joe O'D. You're awful and terrible. And yeah, so the GOP needs to really worry about top of the ticket, and the GOP also has to worry about the voting methods. We can no longer just worry about election day anymore because, hypothetically, if something were to happen in a state, and you were to lose, I don't know, a statewide election by, 530 votes, and, a certain county in that state just did stuff, and I'm not going to say anymore for fear of being taken down, but hypothetically, if there was a single state that I would be talking about, I don't know which state it would be. Anyway, let's discuss Trump's effects on the 2022 midterms.
Get on a raft with Taft.
So let's talk about Trump's effects on the 2022 midterms. During the 2022 primary season, It was overall very good time to beat Trump. He did pretty well. Yeah, he endorsed a lot of people last second, but still, he overall his message won out in a lot of places. But the actual final results were pretty disappointing for Trump and his handpicked candidates and his endorsed candidates. Was Trump at fault? In my opinion, not really. Some of the biggest failures were failures on their own. For example, Doug, he won the primary by around 20 points. Trump endorsed super late. I think Doug would have won either way. You know, his competition was too split and too unwilling to campaign until late. Wisconsin governor, yeah, you can 100% blame Trump on that one. I won't take that away from you. Michaels was just a terrible choice, and he definitely did it because of pettiness, but that's the way it played out. If you argue that Trump should have spent more money on the races, yeah, he could have. But at the same time, he has a primary coming up, and we know that one of his biggest hypothetical opponents definitely has a giant war chest. I mean, DeSantis did spend a lot of money during the general election cycle, but at the same time, he still has a lot of money being left over. Most of the Trump candidates that went on to lose, uh, for example, if we look, not this map, I want this map real quick. For example, if we look on over here, like Masters Lake, they're probably the best examples. The thought process behind people like Lake Masters and Doug was that the MAGA messaging that they would bring would really spike up Republican rural turnout. The Trump's base at the core would spike up. They'd come out in, great numbers, and we would be able to win these seats. Similar in the way that Youngkin won due to extremely high R turnout during his election. We were hoping that we could get really high turnout in basically all the swing states, and we'd be able to beat the Dems purely via turnout. But sadly, these voters don't care if you're Trump-like. They don't care if you're endorsed by Trump. They more or less only care about Trump. And that's just a fault of the current GOP's coalition. We have a coalition that does not come out during midterms, apparently. And hopefully they show up during the 2024, uh, even if Trump's not on the ballot, because otherwise we are in serious trouble. But overall, to be honest, I don't think Trump had too much of a hand in this loss. A lot of it was the establishment was spending money, spending resources to defend itself rather than, actually let us win anything. And there's nothing we could really do about that, unfortunately. As long as the establishment is in charge, they're going to keep protecting themselves, no matter what. It's the way the cookie crumbles, kind of. And one more thing I do want to say, real quick, I do want to touch this up before I do my conclusion. If you were an incumbent this year, wow, congratulations. You did amazingly well just in general. I mean, we even have New Mexico, New Mexico was an improvement for the incumbent, Colorado improvement for the incumbent, Arizona improvement for the incumbent. I think Oregon was an improvement for the incumbent. No, not Oregon. Michigan definitely improvement for the incumbent. Ohio improvement for the incumbent. Florida improvement for the incumbent. Texas improvement for the incumbent. Basically incumbents everywhere just did better typically. And I think that's maybe voters just prefer status quo. Why would you prefer this as your status quo? I don't know, but that's what the voters seem to be preferring. Let's head into a conclusion real quick.
Get on a raft with Taft.
The 2022 midterms were overall a sad excuse for the GOP, despite all the factors pointing towards a big red wave, such as Biden's low approval rating, high gas prices, high inflation. The GOP had poor messaging, bad rural turnout, bad voting strategy, weak top of the tickets where it mattered, close bidder primaries. The establishment was more focused on defending itself, and resource allocation issues all created, at best, a weak red ripple. This also shows the divide between the establishment GOP and the Trump GOP is very much alive, and it's really hurting us a lot. So many people in the primaries, when their preferred candidate lost, they didn't vote for the other candidate, which is something the Dems did not struggle with. And it shows that the cracks in our coalition are incredibly dangerous, and we're walking a very fine line between being able to win and being losing. And I also want to say that this is a interesting midterm in the fact that ever I count anything past 2016 a super polarized era. As ticket splitting begins to die down even more, it helps us in some areas. Iowa, we took out a 30-year incumbent in the AG office, but ticket splitting dies down more and more, and competitive districts kind of die out as well. I think that waves are not really going to be as big as they humanly could be. Let's look at this map real quick of governors. Back in Bush era, long when polarization wasn't an issue, we could have taken, today, this year, we could have taken Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, maybe, and Kansas. We should have taken Kansas. But during the Bush era, during a red wave, we probably could have gone New Mexico, Colorado, Oregon, even, and maybe even Minnesota, Maine probably too. You see, the every year as polarization increases, I think the maximum size for waves are going to slowly die down as we just flip-flop a few seats that are in constant gridlock. I'm not sure. We're going to have to see. But seriously, guys, thank you for watching my first video. I have a little message for you guys at the end of my little credit section. But once again, thank you so much. Please like and subscribe.
The time has come, the fight is on. We've picked the man to run. For president, Ohio sent her noble, worthy son. The man we need, the man to lead our strong and mighty craft. Through storm at sea, to victory, it's William Howard Taft.
Hey guys, just real quick. Once again, thank you all for watching. Little post-credit thing. I just want to say that, as you could see from my intro, all 38 minutes ago, this channel is going to focus on historical politics, probably some war history videos, a lot of history probably, and modern politics and modern politics analysis. For example, I have another video I think I'm going to make, and it's going to be the history of prison design in the United States and how it's actually pretty closely tied to politics. And also at some point I want to go through the Federalist Papers and maybe the Anti-Federalist Papers because I think those would both be very interesting things. But once again, thank you all. Really appreciate it. Have a good one. Enjoy my cat.